The sky over Charlotte, North Carolina, was unusually gray that morning, as if it too sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Pastor Steven Furtick stood by the window of his office at Elevation Church, coffee in hand, staring out into the drizzle. The morning had started like any other. Prayer, devotional, a brief meeting with his team, but something in his spirit felt unsettled. A restlessness he couldn't explain gnawed at the edges of his soul. He had experienced these moments before, divine nudges as he called them, but this one felt heavier, urgent. He grabbed his jacket, told his assistant he'd be back later, and walked out without a destination. His feet guided him more than his mind. As he drove through the heart of the city, the roads slick with rain, memories began to flood in. Streets he hadn't driven through in years, corners that whispered echoes from his past. He found himself near the neighborhood where he grew up, modest, worn down, and still carrying the ghost of childhood, both joyful and painful. He parked the car near an old gas station and decided to walk. It had been years since he'd walked these streets. As he turned a familiar corner near an abandoned basketball court, he stopped cold. There, hunched over on a bench under a flickering streetlight, sat a man wrapped in layers of tattered clothing. A soggy blanket covered his knees. His face was mostly hidden behind a hood and a thick beard, but there was something deeply familiar about him. Steven approached slowly, cautiously, unsure whether it was compassion or disbelief pulling him forward. "Hey, you all right, man?" he asked gently. The man lifted his head just slightly, revealing tired, sunken eyes. There was a flicker of recognition. A name flashed in Steven's mind so suddenly it made him dizzy. "Marcus?" The man blinked, as if the name cracked open something that had been locked away for years. He sat up straighter now, still shivering, and looked hard at Steven. "Steven?" The voice was hoarse, almost unsure. "Steven Furtick?" It hit Steven like a punch to the chest. It was Marcus, his childhood best friend. They had been inseparable once. Basketball after school, bike rides around the block, staying up late talking about dreams and futures they could barely comprehend. And now, Marcus was here, living on the street, barely recognizable, and clearly broken. Steven sank onto the bench beside him, the cold seeping through his clothes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What happened to you, man?" Steven asked, the lump in his throat growing. Marcus chuckled bitterly. "Life," he said simply. "Life happened." Steven couldn't speak for a moment. He looked at Marcus, his hollow cheeks, his worn hands, the sadness in his eyes, and he felt something deep shift inside him. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was God-appointed. "Come with me," Steven said finally. "Let me help you, please." Marcus shook his head. "I don't want your pity, Steven. I know who you are now. Big church, big crowds. You don't need someone like me messing up your image." Steven leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "I don't care about image. I care about you. I care because you're my brother. I care because God put you in front of me today for a reason." Marcus looked at him, unsure whether to trust what he was hearing. He had spent too long being ignored, invisible, passed by like trash on the curb. But Steven's eyes, they weren't full of judgment. They were full of something else. Love. Steven stood up. "Come on. I'll get you food, warm clothes, a place to rest. No strings. Just come." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up with trembling legs and followed Steven back to the car. The drive back was quiet. Marcus stared out the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. Steven couldn't stop glancing over at him. His heart was breaking. Back at Steven's house, his wife Holly opened the door and froze. She looked at Marcus, then back at Steven, silently asking 1,000 questions. "This is Marcus," Steven said softly. "He's staying with us for a while." Without a word, Holly stepped aside and let them in. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold streets. Marcus stood awkwardly in the foyer, unsure what to do. "Come sit," Steven said, guiding him to the living room. "Let's get you cleaned up and we'll talk." Holly brought towels, blankets, and hot soup. Marcus ate slowly, his hands still shaking. After he was done, Steven gave him fresh clothes and showed him to the guest room. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, Steven sat in the dark of his study, praying. He didn't know what God was doing, but he knew this was no accident. Marcus's reappearance was a divine interruption, and Steven was ready to lean into it fully. Little did he know, this act of kindness would spark a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about ministry, friendship, and the meaning of true grace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, casting a golden hue across the guest room. Marcus woke slowly, blinking against the brightness. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The soft mattress beneath him, the clean sheets, the scent of coffee drifting through the air. It all felt like a dream. Then it hit him. He was in Steven's house, in the home of a man he hadn't seen in decades. The same boy who used to split peanut butter sandwiches with him during lunch breaks was now one of the most influential pastors in America. Marcus sat up and rubbed his face. He looked around the room, noticing the framed pictures on the dresser, Steven's family, the church, events that clearly marked milestones in a life well lived, a life that had gone so differently from his own. He felt the familiar sting of shame start to creep in again. Downstairs, Steven was already seated at the kitchen table, reading his Bible, pen in hand. Holly moved around quietly, preparing breakfast. When Marcus stepped into the room, both of them paused. "Good morning," Steven said warmly, standing up. "Morning," Marcus replied, unsure of where to place his hands, unsure of how to exist in this kind of space. Holly smiled. "Coffee?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, please." They ate together in a strange silence that wasn't exactly awkward, but filled with everything unspoken. Marcus avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the steam rising from his mug. Finally, Steven broke the silence. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're not just a guest here, Marcus, you're family." Marcus let out a low breath, almost a laugh. "It's been a long time since I felt like I had any kind of family." "Well, that ends now," Steven said without hesitation. "You've got us." After breakfast, Steven suggested they take a walk. They strolled through the neighborhood, passing by children on bikes and neighbors tending their lawns. Marcus walked slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes downcast. "You know," Steven began, "I've thought about you more than you'd believe." Marcus glanced over. "Really?" "Yeah. After high school, we just lost touch. Life got crazy. I always wondered what happened to you." Marcus nodded slowly. "Things went south fast. My mom died my second year in college. I dropped out, tried to work odd jobs, but nothing stuck. I got into some bad stuff. Drugs mostly. I was angry at God, angry at everyone, and eventually I just disappeared." Steven stopped walking and turned to face him. "You didn't disappear. You were just hiding. From the world. From pain. Maybe from God. But not from me. And definitely not from him." Marcus looked away, biting the inside of his cheek. "You don't know the things I've done, Steven." Steven stepped closer. "And you don't know the grace I've seen, the grace I've lived." They continued walking in silence, the air thick with emotion. That afternoon, Steven made some calls, first to his church leadership, then to his outreach team. He didn't just want to help Marcus temporarily. He wanted to build a bridge, not just for him, but for others like him. Over the next few days, Steven arranged for Marcus to meet with a counselor. He signed him up for a job training program through a partner ministry. He invited him to church, not just as a guest, but as someone with a voice, someone with a story. Marcus resisted at first. "I'm not ready to be around people, especially not church folks. I've seen too many who smile on Sundays and judge the rest of the week." Steven nodded. "I get it. But elevation is different. We're not perfect, but we're real. And I think you'll find more love there than you expect." The following Sunday, Marcus stood nervously at the back of the auditorium. The music had started. The room pulsed with energy and warmth. He watched as people lifted their hands in worship, tears streaming down faces he didn't know. Something began to stir in him, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. When Steven took the stage, he didn't preach from notes that day. He looked out at the crowd and shared something raw, something unexpected. "Today," he said, "I'm going to tell you about someone who changed my life twice. Once when I was a kid and again this week." Marcus froze. "His name is Marcus," Stephen continued, "and he's here with us. He was my best friend growing up, and this week I found him living on the street." The congregation gasped softly. All eyes turned to Marcus, who wanted nothing more than to disappear. But Stephen wasn't finished. He could have rejected me. He could have walked away. But he didn't. And God's not finished with his story yet. I believe with all my heart that Marcus is a walking testimony of the goodness and grace of our God. The crowd erupted in applause. Some stood, others wept. Marcus stood motionless, overwhelmed, tears welling in his eyes. After the service, dozens of people approached him. Some hugged him, others thanked him for his courage. A few shared their own stories of brokenness and redemption. For the first time in years, Marcus felt seen. Not as a failure, not as a problem, but as a person, as a soul, worthy of love. That night, as he sat with Stephen on the back porch watching the stars, Marcus finally spoke the words he hadn't been able to say. "Thank you, man, for not walking past me, for not pretending you didn't see me." Stephen looked at him with sincerity. "I didn't just see you, Marcus. I saw who you were, and who you still are, a child of God." Marcus wiped his eyes. Maybe I can believe that again?" Stephen placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to believe all at once. Just take one step, and I'll walk with you." And in that quiet, sacred moment, under the starlit sky, the journey of healing truly began. The following week brought a strange rhythm to Marcus's life, one he hadn't experienced in years. Mornings began with hot coffee on the porch, shared with Stephen in silence or in soft conversation. Then came counseling sessions, walks, and time at the church office where Stephen had set up a small space for him to volunteer. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He organized books, helped with minor tasks, and spent time just listening to people. It amazed him how open the community was, how ready they were to love someone they didn't know, just because Stephen did. But inside, Marcus still battled shame. Nights were hardest. The memories came like waves, sleeping in alleys, cold nights, the things he had done to survive. His scars were deep and loud, and no matter how kind Stephen was or how many smiles he received, he felt unworthy. One evening after everyone had gone to bed, Marcus sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a glass of water, hands shaking slightly. Stephen came in quietly, barefoot, and leaned against the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know how you do it." "Do what?" "Trust me, after everything." Stephen walked over and sat beside him. "Because I remember who you were before the pain, and I trust the God who's rewriting your story." Marcus laughed bitterly. "I'm not sure he wants anything to do with me." Stephen's voice was gentle but firm. "He never left you, Marcus. Not once. You walked through hell, but God was there the whole time, waiting for this moment." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "But why me?" "Because grace doesn't wait for perfection. It waits for surrender." The next day, Marcus met someone who would become another turning point. Her name was Erica, a young volunteer who ran one of the church's community outreach programs. She had a background in social work and spent her days helping people transition off the streets. When Stephen introduced them, Marcus could barely meet her gaze. But Erica wasn't the type to pity. She looked him in the eye and smiled warmly. "I've heard a lot about you," she said. "And I've seen what God can do with broken stories. You're in good company here." Marcus felt something shift. Her confidence in him, strange and unearned, was like a mirror showing him a version of himself he hadn't imagined in a long time. They talked for hours. About his past, about his fears, about hope. Erica listened without flinching, without judgment, just presence. And that was healing in ways Marcus couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began to come alive again. He helped Erica distribute meals downtown. He shared pieces of his story with others. And though his voice shook and his eyes sometimes filled with tears, he told the truth, raw and real, and it resonated. One man wept in Marcus's arms after he spoke. "I thought I was the only one," he whispered. Marcus began to see that maybe, just maybe, his pain had a purpose. That maybe the years he spent in the dark weren't wasted. but seeds. Seeds that were now beginning to sprout into something beautiful. Steven watched it all with awe. Every small breakthrough in Marcus was a miracle. And yet, it wasn't all easy. There were days Marcus shut down, days the past seemed too loud, too cruel. But he didn't run. Not anymore. One Thursday afternoon, Steven asked Marcus to come with him to a men's Bible study he led. Marcus hesitated, but agreed. They met in a quiet room at the church. A dozen men sat in a circle, some older, some younger. Steven opened with prayer, then surprised everyone. Tonight, someone special is going to lead us. Marcus, would you share your story? Marcus froze. Steven looked at him with quiet encouragement. The room was silent. Marcus cleared his throat. I'm not a preacher. I don't even know if I'm qualified to be here. But I know what it's like to be lost. I know what it's like to lose everything, to be invisible, to beg for food, to cry yourself to sleep in the cold. I've done things I regret deeply, and I lived in shame for years. He paused, the room hanging on every word. But God didn't give up on me, and neither did this man right here, he said, nodding toward Steven. I don't know what you believe, but I believe that grace chased me down when I had nothing to offer, and I'm learning now, maybe for the first time, that I'm still worth something, that I'm not too far gone. No one spoke for a moment. Then one by one the men stood and hugged him. Some wept, others whispered thanks. That night Marcus felt something solid begin to form inside him. A new foundation. That weekend, Steven received a message from a major news outlet. They had heard about Marcus's story, how the well-known pastor had taken in his childhood friend who had been homeless, and they wanted to cover it. Steven hesitated. He didn't want to turn Marcus's journey into a headline, but when he asked Marcus, his response surprised him. Maybe if someone sees it, they'll know they're not alone. Maybe someone who's where I was will see it and believe they can be more. The segment aired the next week. It showed old pictures of the two boys side by side, riding bikes, playing ball. Then it cut to now. Marcus, helping in the food pantry, smiling beside Erica, laughing with Steven. The story went viral, but what shocked people most wasn't just the reunion. It was Steven's humility and Marcus's transformation. How one act of compassion had lit a fire that spread through an entire community. Letters poured in, messages from across the country, people inspired, people repenting, people reconnecting with lost friends, people inviting the homeless into their homes. The ripple effect was undeniable. And Marcus? He stayed humble. He kept serving, kept growing, kept healing, because he knew this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. The wave of attention that followed the televised segment caught everyone off guard. Steven's phone buzzed non-stop for days. Emails flooded the church inbox. Pastors from around the country reached out, asking to connect with Marcus, hoping he could speak at events or share his testimony online. But Steven was careful. He wanted to protect Marcus from being overwhelmed, or worse, exploited. He sat Marcus down one afternoon in the same quiet study where their journey had restarted. Listen, Steven said, his tone serious but calm. There's going to be a lot of people who want to hear your story now. Some will be sincere, some won't. I'll stand with you either way, but you have to be the one to decide how much of yourself you're ready to give. Marcus stared at the floor for a moment before answering. I didn't ask for any of this. I was just trying to survive. But if telling the truth can help someone else survive too, maybe it's worth it. Steven smiled. Then we'll take it one step at a time, together. And so, they did. Marcus began speaking at small recovery meetings and men's groups around Charlotte. His words carried weight, because they were born from lived pain. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He talked about addiction, fear, loss, anger at God, and how that anger slowly melted into surrender. He talked about Steven, about how one person stopping to truly see you could change the course of your life. One evening, after sharing his testimony at a local youth detention center, a teenage boy approached Marcus, tears streaming down his face. I thought I was trash, the boy whispered. But now, I think maybe I'm just hurt, like you were. Marcus hugged him tightly. "You're not trash. You're a story in progress, and there's a chapter waiting for you that's better than this one." Word kept spreading. A publishing company reached out, asking Marcus to consider writing a book. He laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. "Me? Write a book? I barely graduated high school." Steven chuckled. "Then we'll find someone to help you write it. You've already lived the message. That's the part that matters." Despite the sudden attention, Marcus remained grounded. He still lived at Steven's for the time being, though he had started looking for a small place of his own. Erica helped him navigate the logistics, paperwork, bank accounts, employment records. She became a steady friend, someone he could trust. Their connection deepened naturally, without pressure or expectation. She wasn't there to rescue him. She was there to walk beside him. Late one night, as they sat in a quiet diner after an outreach event, Marcus opened up more than he ever had before. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "I used to think God hated me, or maybe forgot me. There were nights I'd scream at the sky begging him to end it all. The silence was worse than the pain." Erica reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "But he wasn't silent," she said softly. "He was waiting and working, even in the dark." Marcus looked at her, his eyes glassy. "You really believe that?" She nodded. "I've lived it too." That moment between them, simple, honest, human, marked a turning point. Marcus began to believe not just in God's grace for others, but for himself, that he was no longer the man defined by his failures, but by his redemption. Steven watched all of this with a quiet joy. He saw Marcus begin to smile again, to laugh more freely. He saw the weight in his eyes slowly lift, replaced by purpose. But healing wasn't linear. One afternoon, months into Marcus's transformation, Steven came home to find Marcus gone. No note, no call, just an empty guest room. His heart dropped. Hours passed. Night fell. Then finally, around 2 a.m., Steven's phone rang. "Can you come get me?" Marcus's voice was low, fragile. Steven didn't ask questions. He just drove. He found Marcus sitting outside an old bar downtown, head in his hands, breathing heavily. He hadn't relapsed, but he'd been close. The day had been hard, memories triggered by a random encounter, a voice from the past that brought shame rushing back like a flood. He had panicked. Run. Steven didn't say a word. He knelt beside him and put an arm around his shoulder. "You didn't fall," Steven whispered. "You reached out. That's strength, not weakness." Marcus broke down, right there on the sidewalk. Years of emotion in a single collapse. Steven stayed until dawn. The next morning, Marcus apologized over and over. "I almost messed everything up." Steven shook his head. "You didn't mess up anything. This is part of the process. God's not keeping score. He's building a testimony." Marcus exhaled slowly. "It just hurts sometimes. The past, the guilt. It still whispers." Steven looked him in the eye. "Then we drown it out with truth. Every time." From that day on, Marcus became more intentional about his healing. He attended group therapy weekly. He journaled. He prayed. And slowly, the whispers grew quieter. By the end of the year, Marcus stood on the main stage at Elevation Church. The room was packed. Cameras streamed the service to millions worldwide. He took a deep breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "I'm not a preacher," he said, echoing his old line, "but I am a living testimony." The crowd leaned in. "I once believed my life was over. I believed I was too far gone, but God never stopped pursuing me. And the man who sits on that front row, my childhood friend, he reminded me of that truth when I needed it most." Steven's eyes filled with tears. So if you're here today, and you feel invisible, if you're watching from somewhere dark, wondering if your story matters, I promise you, it does. Because I'm still here, and so are you. The applause was deafening, but in Marcus's heart, there was only peace. The weeks that followed Marcus's testimony at Elevation Church were nothing short of life-altering. Messages poured in from across the globe, testimonies of people moved to tears, addicts deciding to seek help, parents reconnecting with estranged children, pastors asking for Marcus to visit their churches and share his journey. It was more than a story now. It had become a movement. But through all the buzz, Marcus remained deeply aware of the fragile thread that held it all together: grace. He didn't walk with pride. He walked with awe. Steven made sure to keep him grounded, often pulling him away from the noise to rest, reflect, and recharge. One Saturday, they went fishing. Just the two of them. No cameras, no noise. Just water, sky, and a quiet familiarity. "Remember the creek behind your old house?" Marcus asked, a smile tugging at his mouth. "Of course," Steven replied. "We used to swear there were piranhas in it." Marcus laughed. "You wouldn't put your foot in the water for like 2 summers. "Hey, I was cautious," Steven grinned. "You were the daredevil." Marcus looked out over the lake, then down at the rod in his hands. "I lost that part of me somewhere," he said quietly. Steven cast his line. "I don't think you lost it. I think it got buried under the pain. But it's still there." They fished in silence for a while. Not every conversation needed words. Sometimes presence was enough. Back at the church, the leadership team proposed something bold, creating a new ministry led by Marcus, focused on outreach to the homeless and those re-entering society after prison or addiction. They would call it Grace Walk. Marcus hesitated. It felt like too much, too soon. Steven assured him, "You don't have to be perfect to lead. You just have to be honest. People don't need a saint. They need someone real." With trembling hands but a willing heart, Marcus accepted. The launch of Grace Walk was simple but powerful. They set up tables downtown with warm meals, care packages, and prayer tents. But more than that, they offered connection. Marcus didn't preach with a microphone. He sat on the sidewalk beside men and women and listened. He remembered every face, every cold night, every rejection. And now he looked into the eyes of people still living it, and he reminded them they were seen. Erica worked closely with him, coordinating volunteers, organizing resources, and slowly building trust with those who came. She watched Marcus pour himself into every conversation, not with a savior complex, but with shared humanity, and her respect for him deepened daily. One evening, as they packed up after a long day of outreach, she turned to him and said, "You were made for this." Marcus shook his head. "No, I was broken for this. And somehow, God is using even that." She smiled, moved by the truth in his words. That's exactly what makes it powerful. That night, as Steven and Holly hosted a dinner at their home to celebrate the launch of Grace Walk, Marcus sat at the table surrounded by laughter, candles flickering, and stories being shared. He looked around and realized something stunning. He belonged, not because of what he'd done, but because of what Grace had done through him. During dessert, Steven stood and raised a glass. "To Marcus," he said, "not just for surviving, but for choosing to live, for saying yes when it would have been easier to say no, for letting God use every scar for someone else's healing." Everyone clinked their glasses, and Marcus blinked quickly to keep the tears from spilling. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Marcus lingered on the porch with Steven. "Why did you do it?" Marcus asked. "That day you saw me on the bench. You could have walked away." Steven looked at him with quiet conviction. "Because I knew it was you, and I knew it was a moment that would define the rest of my life," God whispered, "and I couldn't ignore it." Marcus nodded. "You didn't just save my life, you changed it." Steven's gaze softened. "No, Marcus, you let God change it. I was just the friend who didn't look away." A few weeks later, Marcus was invited to share at a national conference for faith-based organizations. He stood on a massive stage before thousands, lights beaming down, cameras rolling. But he didn't try to impress. He did what he always did. He told the truth. "I used to sleep behind dumpsters. I used to think I was invisible, that I'd die and no one would notice. But someone saw me, and through his eyes I saw God. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes salvation doesn't look like a beam of light. Sometimes it looks like an old friend sitting beside you on a bench in the rain." The crowd was silent. Then they rose to their feet. When Marcus stepped off stage, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a vessel. And in that humility, God continued to work. Back home, Grace Walk grew faster than anyone expected. Dozens of lives were being transformed. Former addicts were mentoring newcomers. People were getting jobs, reunified with families, finding purpose again. And Marcus? He stayed present for every story, every step, every soul. Yet, despite the growing success, Marcus remained deeply connected to the memory of who he had been, and who he still could be without Grace. That memory kept him compassionate, kept him tender, kept him praying. One night, Steven found Marcus sitting in the sanctuary long after everyone had left. The lights were low, the room quiet. "You all right?" Steven asked, sliding into the pew beside him. "I'm just overwhelmed," Marcus admitted. "This life I have now, it's beautiful. But sometimes I still feel like that man on the bench." Steven nodded. "You'll feel that sometimes, and that's okay. But the difference is, you're not sitting there alone anymore." Marcus looked up, eyes full of gratitude. "I just hope I never forget." "You won't," Steven replied, "because the ones who remember where they came from are the ones God uses to lead others out." Spring came early to Charlotte that year. The air turned warm, trees bloomed with new life, and everything seemed to reflect the transformation happening within Marcus. Grace Walk had not only become a ministry, it had become a lifeline. Volunteers signed up in droves. Donors from across the country contributed supplies, food, and even vans to transport people to shelters and recovery centers. But Marcus stayed focused on the people, not the praise. One afternoon, while sorting clothes for an upcoming outreach, Erica walked in holding a letter. "This came in for you," she said, handing it to Marcus. It was handwritten, scrawled on torn notebook paper. Marcus unfolded it slowly, his hands instinctively trembling like they used to whenever a reminder from his past showed up. But this wasn't from a collection agency or a prison system. It was from his sister. He hadn't spoken to her in nearly 10 years. The letter was short but powerful. She had seen the news coverage, watched the sermons online, and had been crying ever since. She apologized for giving up on him, confessed how she used to pray for him every night, even after everyone else stopped believing he was alive. "I don't know if you can forgive me," she wrote, "but I would give anything to see you again. You're my brother. I love you. Always have. Always will." Marcus folded the letter slowly, as if afraid it would vanish if he moved too fast. He looked at Erica, eyes filled with disbelief. She never stopped looking for me," he whispered. "You should reach out," Erica said gently. "I'm scared," he admitted. "What if I disappoint her again?" "You won't," she said, "because you're not the same man anymore." It took him 3 days to call her. His fingers hovered over the screen so many times, heart racing, breath short. But when he finally did, the voice that answered cracked with tears before he even said hello. "Marcus?" she whispered. "Hey," he said, his voice barely holding steady. "It's me." The reunion was quiet but powerful. She flew in from California a week later, and Steven hosted them at his home for dinner. When she walked in and saw her brother standing in the kitchen, clean, healthy, alive, she burst into sobs and hugged him so tightly it took his breath away. "I thought I lost you," she said over and over. "But God gave you back to me." Marcus didn't try to explain what had happened. He just let her see him. The real him. The one who had almost died 1,000 invisible deaths and somehow survived to tell the story. Later that night, after she had gone to her hotel, Marcus sat with Steven on the porch again. "I used to pray for a second chance," Marcus said. "Not at life, at love, at family. I didn't think I deserved it, but he gave it to me anyway." Steven nodded, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "That's what grace is. A gift you never earned, but can't live without." By the summer, Marcus was speaking at churches almost weekly, but he never let the attention inflate his ego. Every time he stepped up to a microphone, he reminded himself of the man on the bench. He carried a picture of that moment in his wallet, a reminder of the turning point, the lowest place that became holy ground. One weekend, a large conference invited both Marcus and Steven to speak. They agreed to do it together, side by side, a full-circle moment that no one could have scripted. Standing before a crowd of thousands, Steven opened. "Some of you know my story, but today you'll hear a better one. A story of redemption. A story of friendship. A story of how God's grace can turn a bench on a street corner into an altar of hope." He turned to Marcus, who took a breath and stepped forward. "I thought I was forgotten, but I wasn't. I thought I was finished, but I wasn't. And I thought my story was a tragedy, but it turns out it was just the first chapter of a miracle." Wait, the audience rose to their feet before he could finish the sentence. Afterward, people waited in long lines just to thank him, hug him, share their own broken pieces. And Marcus welcomed every one of them, knowing that what they needed wasn't perfection. It was permission. Permission to believe that their worst moments didn't define their worth. That night, Steven and Marcus walked through the quiet city streets where it had all started. "Right here," Marcus said, pointing to the old bench. "This is where God found me." Steven smiled. "And where you found yourself again." They stood in silence, the city moving slowly around them. Then Marcus turned, voice steady. "I want to buy this bench." Steven laughed. "You what?" "I want to buy it, restore it, put a plaque on it. Not for me. For anyone who sits there and thinks they're beyond redemption. I want them to know. Hope sat here once." Steven was quiet, then nodded. "I think that's one of the most powerful ideas I've ever heard." Within weeks, the city granted permission. The bench was removed, refinished, and returned with a bronze plaque that read, "Here sat a man the world forgot, and a friend who refused to. Grace found them both." The story went viral again. But Marcus didn't care about the press anymore. What mattered to him was that every time someone passed that bench, they'd see proof that no one is too far gone, that a single act of compassion can change the course of a life. And though Marcus's story was far from over, he now lived each day as a man on mission. Not to impress, not to be admired, but to reach back for others still sitting in the shadows. He had once been broken, but now he was becoming whole. One life at a time. The bench became more than a symbol. It became a destination. People came from neighboring cities just to sit there, to reflect, to cry, to pray. Some brought flowers, others left notes. Every now and then, Marcus would quietly visit, sitting on that very spot where his lowest point had collided with God's grace. One morning, as the sun crept over the skyline, Marcus arrived before dawn. He sat alone, hood up, coffee in hand, watching the city slowly awaken. A young woman approached hesitantly, pushing a shopping cart filled with blankets and worn clothes. She paused when she saw him. "You him?" she asked. Marcus turned. "Depends who you're looking for." The man from the video, the one who used to live out here." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was me." She lowered her eyes. "I sleep behind the bus station most nights. Been a long time since I felt human." Marcus didn't flinch. He stood, motioned for her to sit, and without a word, handed her his coffee. Then he sat down beside her. "You are human," he said softly, "and you're not alone." They sat there for nearly an hour, in silence. At one point she cried quietly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat. When she finally stood to leave, she asked, "Why are you still here? Why keep coming back?" He smiled gently. "Because someone found me here once, and I want to be here in case someone else is looking." Word of Marcus's quiet ministry spread further. People started calling him the shepherd of the street bench. Media outlets wanted more interviews, but Marcus rarely accepted. He had no interest in celebrity. Instead, he poured himself into Grace Walk, training new leaders, expanding services, mentoring young men coming out of addiction or incarceration. One of those men, a 21-year-old named Dre, had just completed a 6-month recovery program. Marcus saw something in him, something raw but full of potential. He invited Dre to shadow him during outreach events, letting him slowly step into leadership roles. "You see him?" Dre asked one afternoon, nodding toward a man passed out behind a dumpster. "That was me, a year ago." Marcus nodded. "That was me too. Now we get to go back for him." Dre grinned. "Feels good." "Feels like grace," Marcus said. Steven watched all of this unfold with quiet pride. Elevation Church had grown, yes, but more than that, it had deepened. The congregation was no longer just inspired. They were activated. Outreach teams doubled. Baptisms skyrocketed. People began serving not because of a Sunday sermon, but because of a weekday story. Marcus's story. One day, Steven invited Marcus to join him in the recording studio for a podcast episode. "I want people to hear what it means to walk through redemption," Steven said, "not just talk about it." Marcus agreed. The episode was raw, no script, no prep. Just two old friends talking about pain, pride, forgiveness, and the hard work of healing. It ended with Steven asking, "If you could speak to the version of yourself from 5 years ago, the man sitting on that bench, what would you say?" Marcus paused, eyes closing. "I'd say, hold on. Help is coming. And when it does, don't run. Let it in. You're not beyond repair. You're not forgotten. You're not trash. You're a miracle in the making." The episode reached millions in a matter of days. Testimonies flooded in. Parents shared it with struggling teens. Pastors played it in recovery groups. Inmates listened to it in prison chapels. It sparked a revival that no one had predicted, but everyone felt coming. Still, Marcus remained cautious. "Steven," he said one evening over dinner, "I don't want to become a brand. I just want to stay faithful." Steven nodded. "Then just keep doing what you're doing. Stay close to the source. Let the fruit speak for itself." That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, a small place downtown that he now called home, and opened his journal. He hadn't written in a while, but the words came easily. "I used to measure my worth by the weight of my mistakes. Now I measure it by the grace I didn't earn, but still received. This story, my story, isn't about me. It's about a God who sat beside me when no one else would, and a friend who remembered who I was when I had forgotten." He closed the journal and looked out the window at the lights of the city. So much had changed, yet some things never would. The bench still stood quietly, visited daily by strangers and saints alike. Steven still called or dropped by just to check in, no matter how busy his schedule. And Marcus? He still returned to that bench every week, not out of habit, but out of gratitude, because that's where his resurrection began. Autumn crept into the city with golden leaves and crisp winds that whispered of change. Marcus had always loved this time of year. It felt like the world exhaled, like nature itself was letting go. And that's what he found himself doing more and more, letting go of old fears, old labels, old chains. But with that freedom came a growing sense of responsibility. One evening after a packed Grace Walk event, Marcus sat on the back steps of the community center, sipping tea while the last volunteers cleaned up inside. Erica joined him, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "You know," she said, smiling, "there was a time when we couldn't get more than 10 people to show up. Tonight there were nearly 200. Marcus looked down, humbled. "Yeah, but I still feel like I'm just figuring it out as I go." "You are," she said. "We all are. But you're leading with love, and that's why people follow." There was a pause, comfortable, like the silence between songs. "I've been thinking," Marcus said softly, "about starting a transitional home for men coming out of recovery, a place where they can live, work, pray, rebuild. I know what it's like to walk out of rehab with nowhere to go, no one to call. I want to change that." Erica's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what the city needs." "Sure you think it's possible?" "I think God already planted the seed. Now it's time to build." Over the next month, Marcus met with local leaders, church board members, and city officials. Steven offered the full support of Elevation Church, connecting Marcus with donors and real estate agents. It wasn't easy. Permits, logistics, funding, each step was a battle. But Marcus moved forward with quiet determination. When they finally secured a rundown property on the edge of downtown, Marcus stood outside with a key in his hand, staring at the faded door. Steven was beside him, smiling like a proud brother. "You ready?" Steven asked. Marcus nodded. "I've been ready my whole life." They walked in together, stepping over debris and dust, already seeing what could be. Rooms became dormitories in their minds. The cracked kitchen turned into a place of shared meals and laughter. The empty backyard became a future garden of healing. The renovations began the next week. Volunteers showed up in force. Some were former addicts, others were single moms, retired contractors, even businessmen on their day off. Everyone wanted to be part of something redemptive. They called it the Restoration House. And Marcus, he didn't lead from the top. He led from the floor, scraping, painting, hauling furniture, hugging every person who walked through those doors. He prayed over every wall, every bed, every empty room waiting to be filled with second chances. On opening day, the first resident arrived. His name was Calvin, 47 years old, fresh out of rehab, no family, no job, just a worn backpack and eyes that couldn't meet anyone else's. Marcus greeted him at the door. "I'm Marcus," he said, extending a hand. Calvin hesitated, then shook it weakly. "You're safe here," Marcus continued. "This isn't a shelter. This is a home. And you're not a client, you're family." Calvin didn't speak for a long moment. Then his voice cracked as he whispered, "I haven't heard those words in years." Within 2 weeks, the Restoration House was at capacity. And yet something magical happened. Men who had been rejected and forgotten began mentoring each other. They cooked together, they studied scripture together, they walked through recovery not just with rules, but with relationship. Steven visited often, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. One night, he pulled Marcus aside after dinner. "You're doing it," Steven said. "You're changing lives every day." Marcus shook his head. "God is. I'm just showing up." Steven chuckled. Funny how showing up is the one thing most people forget to do. As winter approached, the ministry expanded. Local schools asked Marcus to speak to at-risk teens. A nearby prison opened their chapel to him once a month. Grace Walk started training other churches on how to build their own outreach models. And through it all, Marcus stayed deeply rooted in the moment. He never let the growth distract him from the people. One night, he walked the halls of the Restoration House after lights out, stopping by each room to pray silently for its occupant. When he reached the last door, he paused. Inside was a young man named Jalen, barely 19, recently released from juvenile detention, terrified of becoming his father. Marcus leaned against the wall and prayed out loud, softly, "God, let him know he's not defined by the worst thing he's ever done. Let him feel, even for one moment, that he is loved, not just by you, but by us." The next morning, Jalen met Marcus in the kitchen, eyes red, face soft. "Did you pray for me last night?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "Yeah. Why?" "Because I felt it." That's when Marcus realized something profound. Healing didn't always look like big sermons or loud miracles. Sometimes it looked like one man kneeling in a hallway, whispering hope in the dark. That December, as snow dusted the city, the Restoration House held its first Christmas dinner. The men wore donated dress shirts and took turns sharing what the past few months had meant to them. Calvin, once unable to make eye contact, now stood tall, smiling as he read a poem he'd written. Jalen played a song on the keyboard. Dre gave a short devotion that brought everyone to tears. Marcus sat at the head of the table, overcome. He thought of the bench, the rain, the brokenness, and now this table full of redemption. He looked to the ceiling, eyes glistening. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, for not letting me disappear." Steven stood and raised his glass once again. "To Marcus," he said, "to the man who reminded us all that no one is too lost to be found." And around that table, in a once-abandoned building now full of life, Grace had the final word once again. As the new year dawned, the impact of the Restoration House was being felt far beyond Charlotte. Other cities reached out, asking for guidance on replicating the model. Churches invited Marcus to consult, and Christian media platforms offered him book deals and speaking tours. But Marcus kept his heart anchored in the mission, often repeating one simple phrase whenever people tried to elevate him too highly. "I'm not a celebrity. I'm just a survivor who stayed." One cold January morning, Marcus received a letter that brought him to his knees. It came from a man named Raymond, a former childhood friend who had once bullied Marcus relentlessly in school. The letter began with a confession, how Raymond had carried guilt for decades, never forgetting the shame he had caused. He had seen the news coverage about Grace Walk and the Restoration House and had been weeping ever since. "I didn't know what you were going through back then," Raymond wrote. "I didn't know the home you came from. I just knew how to hurt people before they hurt me. I was broken too. I just hid it differently." Raymond ended the letter asking for a chance to meet and apologize in person. Marcus read the letter twice, then placed it on the edge of his desk and stared out the window for a long time. That part of his past, the part that had shaped his deepest insecurities, was now reaching out for redemption, and he knew what he had to do. He met Raymond 2 weeks later at a small cafe near the edge of town. The man who walked in was no longer the teenage tormentor Marcus remembered. Raymond looked older, tired, humbled by life. The moment they locked eyes, no words were needed. Raymond broke down crying before he even sat down. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Marcus reached across the table, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to deserve it," he said softly. "That's what makes it grace." They talked for hours, sharing stories, opening old wounds, stitching them up with laughter and tears. By the end of the meeting, Raymond asked if he could volunteer at the Restoration House. Marcus smiled. "We always have room for one more." That moment sparked something new in Marcus, an understanding that forgiveness didn't just heal the victim. It healed the offender too, and that some of the most powerful testimonies came not from strangers, but from reconciled relationships once torn apart. That spring, Marcus was honored by the city of Charlotte for his contributions to the community. A ceremony was held downtown, with city officials, pastors, residents, and hundreds of Grace Walk members attending. As Marcus stepped up to receive the award, he paused, holding the plaque in his hand. "I'm honored," he said into the mic, "but this doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every person who's ever been told they weren't worth saving. Every soul who walked through fire and came out with scars that told the truth. This is for the ones still waiting on a bench hoping someone sees them." The crowd rose in applause, many with tears streaming down their faces. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Marcus spotted an elderly man near the edge of the park, sitting alone, holding a cardboard sign. Marcus walked over, knelt down, and asked the man his name. "Walter," the man replied. "Just trying to get to tomorrow." Marcus nodded. "I know how that feels." He sat with Walter for nearly 2 hours, gave him food, a fresh pair of socks, and a ride to the shelter where a spot had just opened. Before he left, Walter looked him in the eyes and said, "You don't act like a preacher." Marcus smiled. "I'm not. I'm a bench sitter, just like you." The weeks passed with quiet momentum. Lives kept changing. Grace kept moving. The Restoration House welcomed its 50th resident. Dre got offered a full-time position leading the mentorship program. Calvin began studying for his GED. And Marcus? He finally started working on his book, not because he wanted to be published, but because he knew someone out there needed those words. Erica remained his closest ally. Their friendship had deepened into something sacred. Slow, steady, respectful. One evening, after church service, they walked side by side through the park. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. "All the time," Marcus replied, "but I try to stay here, in this moment." "I admire that," she said. "You've taught me more about patience than anyone else I know." They paused by the bench, the same one that had become holy ground. "I used to think my story ended here," Marcus said quietly. "But now I know. It began here." Erica looked at him, something soft and certain in her eyes. "So, what chapter are you in now?" He smiled. "The one where I stop surviving and start truly living." A gust of wind passed between them, rustling the trees. Marcus turned toward her, a question in his eyes. Not rushed, not desperate, just honest. "Can I walk into that chapter with you?" Erica's smile said everything before her words did. "Yes, you already are." Later that night, Steven sat on his porch with Holly, watching the stars above the quiet neighborhood where it all began. "You think he ever imagined this?" Holly asked. Steven shook his head. I don't even think I imagined it. But you saw something in him when no one else did." Steven thought for a moment. "I didn't just see Marcus. I saw what God was about to do, and I was just lucky enough to say yes." Spring melted gently into summer, and with it came warmth that touched more than the skin. It reached deep into the bones of the city. The restoration house expanded to a second location, this time for women. Erica took the lead on that project, partnering with local churches and recovery organizations. Marcus stood by her side every step of the way, not out of obligation, but out of reverence for her calling and strength. Together they were building something that neither of them could have ever imagined in their darkest days: sanctuaries, not just shelters, places of dignity, safety, and resurrection. Meanwhile, Grace Walk's weekly outreach events had become a cornerstone of community transformation. Entire blocks were now familiar with the movement. Families in crisis came for groceries and stayed for prayer. Addicts came for warm food and left with hope. Elderly folks came just to be seen. What once began with one man's broken heart had become a citywide embrace. But as the ministry grew, so did the pressures. Marcus began to feel it. Late nights, long meetings, constant decisions. He was no longer just helping people, he was leading systems, and that weight, though sacred, was heavy. One afternoon, Steven pulled him aside after a leadership lunch. "You look tired," Steven said. "I am," Marcus admitted, "but it's a good kind of tired, the kind that reminds you it's worth it." Steven studied him for a moment, then asked, "When's the last time you took a real break?" Marcus smirked. "Define real." Steven grinned back. "One where you put your phone down, one where you don't visit the bench, one where you just rest." Marcus sighed. "It's hard, man. Rest feels selfish when you know people are still out there hurting. But rest," Steven said gently, "isn't selfish. It's spiritual. Even Jesus stepped away from the crowds, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to come back full." That conversation stuck with Marcus. A week later, he and Erica took a weekend trip to the mountains. No schedule, no outreach. Just hiking, stargazing, and silence. It was on one of those hikes, sitting on a large rock overlooking a valley painted with wildflowers, that Marcus opened up about something he'd never said out loud. "You know," he said, watching the wind ripple through the trees, "for a long time I thought God was punishing me." Erica turned to look at him but didn't interrupt. "I thought every bad thing that happened, the addiction, the streets, the isolation, I thought I deserved it, that maybe I had used up all my second chances." And now?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Now I think maybe all of that pain was the path, not the punishment." Erica reached over and took his hand. "That's why people trust you, Marcus, because you don't hide the pain. You walk through it, and you let others walk with you." He looked at her, heart full. "I want to walk with you, for real, not just in ministry, in life." She didn't hesitate. "You already are." That weekend marked a quiet shift. When they returned to Charlotte, Marcus led with more clarity, more peace. He wasn't chasing healing anymore. He was living it. And from that place of strength, he poured into others with even more grace. One morning, as he walked into the original restoration house, he was surprised to find a group of residents gathered in the kitchen with balloons, cards, and a banner that read, "Thank you, Marcus." They had secretly organized a celebration of his birthday, a day he had never once publicly acknowledged since coming off the streets. Jalen, the once hardened 19-year-old now leading morning devotionals, stood up and spoke on behalf of the group. "You gave us more than food and beds," Jalen said. "You gave us a reason to try again. You saw us when we didn't want to be seen. And now, we see you, not as the man on the bench, but as the man who refused to leave anyone behind." Marcus couldn't speak. He just hugged every single person in that room. That evening, Steven and Holly hosted a dinner for him at their house. Erica was there, along with Dre, Calvin, and others who had walked through different chapters of Marcus's new life. As the night wore on, Steven stood to offer a toast. "I've known Marcus since we were boys," he began, "and I've seen him at his best and his worst. But tonight I want to honor the man he's become. Not because of what he built, but because of how he loves. Marcus taught us all that grace doesn't knock politely. It shows up in the rain, sits on a bench, and waits for someone to believe it again. Marcus wiped his eyes, heart overflowing. After the guests left and the house grew quiet, he sat alone for a moment in Steven's backyard, looking up at the stars. He thought of the boy he used to be. He thought of the man on the bench. He thought of the friend who stopped, the God who stayed, and the future still unfolding. And in that stillness, he whispered something he had never dared to say before. "I forgive you." He wasn't talking to Steven. He was talking to himself. Summer gave way to the soft amber tones of early autumn once more, and the rhythm of the city slowed just enough for Marcus to feel it in his soul. Leaves scattered the sidewalks outside the restoration house, and the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. The once abandoned building now felt like a home in every sense of the word. Inside, Marcus sat across from a young man named Tyrese, a recent arrival from a local halfway house. Barely 23, Tyrese had lived more years in pain than peace. He barely spoke during intake, his hoodie pulled low over his eyes, shoulders hunched in defense. But today was different. "I used to think people like you were fake," Tyrese said, looking down at his hands. "Pastors, mentors, whatever. Always talking about grace, but never living it." Marcus leaned back, patient. "But then I saw you fixing a broken toilet at 7 a.m. I saw you praying with a guy who cussed you out the day before. You're, not like the others." Marcus smiled softly. "You know why I'm still here, Tyrese?" Tyrese shook his head. "Because somebody sat down next to me when I had nothing. No home. No plan. Just guilt and cold pavement. He didn't preach at me. He didn't throw me money. He just sat with me. And that changed everything." Tyrese looked up for the first time, his eyes full of cautious hope. "So, there's still time for me?" "There's always time," Marcus said. "As long as you're breathing, you've got purpose." Moments like these happened more and more often now. The house was full of transformation, not just of habits and behavior, but of identities. Men who once identified as broken, forgotten, or criminal now walked with new names: brother, leader, son, disciple. Marcus often marveled at it all, not with pride, but with gratitude. But even in the brightest seasons, challenges came. One evening, during a routine outreach downtown, Dre was assaulted by a man under the influence. The man had come in angry, flailing, shouting that the church people were hypocrites. Dre tried to calm him, but was shoved hard against a food table. The volunteers scattered, and it took police a full 10 minutes to arrive. Steven was the first to call Marcus. "I'm so sorry, man. Dre's at the hospital now. He's okay, just shaken and bruised." Marcus dropped everything and drove straight there. When he walked into the hospital room, Dre was sitting up in bed, a bandage over his eyebrow, one arm in a sling. Still, he grinned when he saw Marcus. "You should see the other guy," he joked. Marcus chuckled, but his eyes were wet. "You didn't deserve that." "None of us did. But I'm not mad. I feel bad for him. He's still in the storm." Marcus sat beside him. "I just hate that you got hurt doing the right thing." Dre shrugged. "If we're doing this for recognition, we'll quit the first time we're rejected. But if we're doing this for them, for the ones we used to be, then we keep showing up, even when it hurts." Marcus felt a deep conviction settle into his bones. Dre was right. Pain didn't mean failure. In fact, it often meant they were getting close to the core of someone's brokenness. That night, Marcus stood before the team of volunteers and addressed the incident. "We're not here to fix people," he said. "We're here to love them. And love is risky. It means getting close enough to get hurt. But I'd rather be hurt with someone than safe and distant from them. So if you're here for comfort, I'll understand if you walk away. But if you're here for calling, then this is where the real work begins." No one left. The next week, more people showed up to volunteer than ever before. Meanwhile, the second restoration house, led by Erica and her team, had begun welcoming women from domestic violence shelters, trafficking recovery programs, and long-term addiction care. The testimonies emerging from those walls were just as powerful. One of them came from a woman named Mariana, who had crossed the border at age 15, been trafficked, arrested, and released into the streets of Charlotte with nothing but a blanket and a worn Bible. Under Erica's care, Mariana learned English, earned her GED, and started a small business making custom candles. At a church service one Sunday, she stood trembling behind the podium and said in broken but beautiful English, "I was once invisible, but now, because of Jesus and these people, I see myself again." Marcus watched from the front row, overwhelmed. He thought of how Erica had poured her whole soul into those women, how Steven had risked his reputation by opening his home to a man from the streets, and how one act of compassion had become an unstoppable river of redemption. One afternoon, while walking downtown, Marcus stopped by the bench again. He found a handwritten note taped to the backrest. It read, "I don't know who you are, but I sat here and cried for an hour. Then I got up and asked for help. I think this bench saved my life. No name, no number, just the truth." Marcus folded the note, placed it in his wallet, and closed his eyes. He whispered a prayer. Not loud, not fancy, just real. "Lord, let me never forget this bench. Let me never forget how you found me here. And let me never stop sitting down beside the next soul who needs to know they're not alone." He stood and walked away slowly, the city humming around him, the mission alive in his every step. He was no longer the man the world had forgotten. He was the man who remembered everyone else. The crispness of fall settled into the air as the city of Charlotte prepared for its annual Thanksgiving outreach. What once had been a small table of meals served under a tent by Grace Walk was now a full-scale community gathering at a local park. Hundreds of people, dozens of churches, and food enough to feed a small town. And at the heart of it all was Marcus, quietly moving between tables, giving hugs, loading plates, and making everyone feel seen. This year, there was something different about the event. More than food or donations, people were sharing their stories. A man stood near the fire pit and read a poem about his journey from prison to purpose. A mother tearfully testified how Grace Walk helped her reunite with her children. And then came Jalen. The once fractured teenager, now working full-time with youth ministry, stood before the crowd and told them the truth. "I was angry, lost. I didn't care about nobody, including myself. But then I met Marcus. He didn't try to fix me, he just stayed. Even when I pushed him away, he stayed. And now, I want to be that kind of man for someone else." The audience clapped. Some cried. Marcus stayed near the back, hands in his pockets, humbled by how far things had come. Steven approached him, holding a coffee. "Pretty amazing, huh?" he said. Marcus nodded. "It still doesn't feel real sometimes." "That's how you know it's God," Steven said. "If it felt too natural, we'd probably be taking credit for it." They laughed softly, then stood in silence as a group of kids ran by with painted faces and plates of food. It was noisy, joyful, chaotic, and perfect. Later that night, after the last table had been folded and the last piece of trash picked up, Marcus sat alone in the front seat of his car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't move for a long time. He just breathed, reflected. He thought about the year that had changed everything, about the bench, about the house, about Tyrese and Jalen and Dre, about Erica, about Steven, about a God who had written a story no one, including Marcus, could have predicted. The next morning, he woke to a message from his sister. "Are you free for a call today? I need to talk. It's important." He called her right away. Through tears, she explained that their estranged father, whom Marcus hadn't seen in more than 20 years, was dying. Liver failure. He was in a small hospice care facility asking for him. At first, Marcus felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just numbness. "He left us," Marcus said. "He never even said goodbye." "I know," his sister whispered, "but maybe this is our goodbye. You always talk about grace, Mark. Maybe this is one more chance to give it." He agreed to go. The facility was small and quiet, tucked behind a line of oak trees. The nurse led him into a dimly lit room, where an old man lay motionless under thin blankets. His once strong frame was now frail, his face sunken. When the man opened his eyes, he squinted at Marcus for a long time. "Marcus?" "Yeah," Marcus said, voice low. "I didn't think you'd come," the man whispered. Marcus sat down slowly. "I almost didn't. A long pause stretched between them. "I'm sorry," his father finally said, "for leaving, for everything." Marcus nodded. He didn't offer immediate forgiveness. He didn't even know if he could. But he stayed. For an hour. Then 2. They didn't say much. But eventually, his father asked one question. "What made you turn your life around?" Marcus looked at him. A bench. And a friend who didn't keep walking. That night, Marcus didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply journaled. "Grace is not about what they deserve. It's about what I've received too much of to keep to myself." Days later, his father passed. Marcus attended the funeral, not to honor the pain, but to release it. Erica stood with him. Steven sat behind him. And in that small chapel, Marcus felt a kind of freedom he had never known. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was letting go of the power the pain once had. By the time Christmas approached, the restoration houses were glowing with lights and warmth. Trees decorated with handmade ornaments, fireplaces crackling, laughter echoing through the halls. Erica organized a family dinner for both houses to come together. Over 100 men and women gathered in one space, eating, singing, sharing stories. No one left behind, no one alone. As the evening came to a close, Marcus stood up quietly and looked around. He cleared his throat. "A year ago," he said, "I was sleeping outside. No home, no direction. I didn't know if I'd live to see another Christmas. And now, I'm standing in a room full of miracles. Not because I deserved it, but because grace doesn't need you to deserve it. It just needs you to receive it." He paused. "I want each of you to know, you're not just guests here. You are this house. You are this family. And if God can rebuild me, He can rebuild anyone. Keep going. Don't quit. Grace is closer than you think." The room erupted in applause. People cried. People hugged. People believed. And as Marcus stepped down from the little platform they'd made from old pallets, he felt something he'd never felt, not even in his childhood. He felt whole. Not fixed, not flawless, but whole. Later that night, he walked with Erica in the cold, their breath visible in the air. "You've come a long way," she said, slipping her gloved hand into his. He looked at her, love evident in his eyes. "So have we." She leaned into him as they walked on in silence. Two broken hearts, made whole by the God who sits beside us, even when no one else does. And far in the distance, that old bench sat quietly in the dark, still waiting for the next miracle. The new year brought with it a sense of sacred momentum. By January's end, the third restoration house was underway. This one designed for young adults aged 18 to 25, aging out of the foster care system. Marcus knew from experience how easy it was to fall through the cracks when no one was watching, when no one followed up after a court date or graduation or arrest. He wanted to make sure no young person ever again believed the lie that they were disposable. The property had been donated by a retired couple who had watched Marcus's journey unfold from the beginning. They said the land had sat unused for years, waiting for something holy to happen on it. Marcus promised to honor it. Every Thursday afternoon, he drove out to the lot and prayed over it, walking its edges, visualizing the future. Rooms filled with laughter, counseling sessions, workshops on budgeting and mental health, and above all, peace. He brought Tyrese with him most weeks, letting him be part of the design conversations. Tyrese, now in school for social work, was slowly becoming a leader himself. "You ever think you'd be building homes for people like us?" Tyrese asked one day, kicking dirt under his sneakers. Marcus smiled. "I didn't think I'd have a home again, let alone build one." They stood there side by side, the wind brushing over the tall grass, the sun warming their backs. "I want to be like you," Tyrese said quietly. Marcus looked at him. "Don't be like me. Be better than me. Be the man I needed when I was your age." Tyrese nodded slowly. "I think I'm becoming him." That night, Marcus sat alone on his porch, sipping tea, the cold air making his breath curl upward into the dark. He pulled a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, his journal from his first year out of the streets. He hadn't opened it in a long time. As he turned the pages, he saw pain in the ink, anger, desperation, questions without answers. But he also saw growth, raw faith. moments of beauty in the ashes. One entry caught his eye. Maybe my story won't be for me. Maybe it's for the next one, sitting alone in the rain, wondering if anyone still sees them. He closed the notebook gently. The next day, a letter arrived at the church office. It was from a young woman in Seattle who had seen a clip of Marcus speaking online. She wrote of her own battle with addiction and homelessness, and how she'd watched his story while sitting outside a convenience store, cold and hopeless. I thought I was the only one. I don't even know why I'm writing this. But if someone could see you, then maybe there's still someone who could see me too. Marcus read the letter twice, then called Erica. "I want to start something new," he said. "Something for the ones who aren't here yet, the ones who don't know we exist, the ones still out there." Erica already knew what he meant. Within a month, they launched the Scene Project, a media initiative that shared stories from people in recovery, people once forgotten, now restored. Testimonies, art, spoken word, raw letters. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't branded, but it was real. The first post they published was simply a photo of the bench. Caption, "This is where I was found. Where will you be?" It reached millions in a week. Hundreds of messages poured in. People asking for help. People confessing addictions. People simply saying, "Thank you, I thought I was the only one." Marcus knew what came next. He and Erica began planning trips to cities with high homelessness rates, small towns with no recovery support, rural shelters begging for resources. They didn't go to preach. They went to sit, to listen, to see. On one of their first trips to Nashville, Marcus met a man named Curtis, a Vietnam vet who had been on the streets since before Marcus was even born. They sat under a bridge for hours. Curtis shared stories of trauma, of loss, of watching friends die and not being able to cry anymore. Marcus didn't try to offer answers. He just handed him a hot meal and sat quietly, shoulder to shoulder. "You different," Curtis finally said. "How so?" "You listen. You don't look at me like I'm trash." Marcus smiled. "Because you're not. You're a man who survived, and you deserve to be seen." Before they left, Curtis reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled photo. Him and his daughter, taken before the war. "You think God still wants me?" he asked, voice shaking. Marcus looked him in the eye. He never stopped. That night in the hotel room, Erica curled up next to Marcus and said, This is what I've been waiting my whole life to do." He held her close. "Me too." They didn't need applause or platforms, just the presence of grace moving through city streets like living water. By the time they returned to Charlotte, Marcus was more convinced than ever. His calling wasn't a one-time rescue. It was a lifetime of returning to the benches of the world, over and over again, for the forgotten, for the left behind, for the man still hiding in shame, and for the child inside him who once wondered if anyone would ever come looking. By early spring, the name Scene Project had spread far beyond what Marcus and Erica had envisioned. It wasn't just a campaign anymore. It had become a movement. Schools reached out asking for story circles. Recovery centers requested Marcus to visit. Cities with rising homelessness asked how they could replicate Restoration House in their communities. But even with all the attention, Marcus kept the mission simple: keep showing up. One Thursday morning, as he walked into the original Restoration House, he saw Tyrese in the dining room, mentoring two new arrivals. He stopped at the doorway, watching quietly as Tyrese explained how to apply for a bus pass, how to get an ID replaced, how to navigate shame without shutting down. "You'll want to isolate," Tyrese was saying, "but don't. Let people in. It's the only way this works." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. Just a year ago, Tyrese could barely make eye contact with anyone. Now he was helping others rebuild their lives. And the beauty of it all? He didn't even know how much light he carried. Later that day, Steven and Marcus met at a local cafe, the same one where they used to sit and dream when Marcus was first learning how to live again. "I heard about Nashville," Steven said. "And the Seattle project? You're moving, man." Marcus smiled. "It's bigger than I ever thought it would be. You ready for it?" Marcus stirred his coffee. "Most days, yes. Some days, I still feel like the guy on the bench. Steven nodded slowly. Maybe that's what keeps you grounded, remembering that you're still capable of falling. Marcus looked at him with a soft grin. Falling and being caught, that's what keeps me moving. Steven leaned back, thoughtful. I think it's time you preached, Marcus. Marcus froze. What? A message. From the pulpit. Sunday service. You've got the heart, the voice, the story. People need to hear it from you directly. I'm not a preacher, man. You're a truth teller. That's more powerful than a title. Marcus hesitated. He had spoken at youth groups, shelters, even conferences, but never from a pulpit during a full Sunday service. I'll pray about it, he finally said. But the truth was, the idea both terrified and thrilled him. He talked to Erica that night. I think God's been preparing you for this since the moment you stood up from that bench, she said. You don't have to perform. Just be real. So he said yes. Sunday morning arrived like a slow heartbeat. He wore simple clothes. No tie, no robe, just jeans and a dark shirt. Steven introduced him with pride, sharing briefly about Marcus's journey. Then he handed him the mic. The auditorium was full. People leaned forward. Some already had tissues in hand. Marcus took a breath. I'm not here to impress you, he began. I'm here to tell you the truth that saved my life. He told them everything, about the streets, the addiction, the cold, the loneliness, about the bench, about Steven, about how grace didn't come wrapped in lightning but in quiet kindness. I sat on a bench thinking I was forgotten, but God never forgot me. He found me, through a friend, through love, through staying power. He paused. And now, I get to do for others what someone did for me, not because I'm perfect, but because I remember what it feels like to be invisible. The room was silent. Then Marcus said something that stayed with the church for weeks. If you've been walking past benches your whole life, maybe it's time to sit down and listen. You might just find your calling sitting right next to you. The room erupted in applause, but Marcus didn't swell with pride. He wept. Right there on stage. Because in that moment he knew this was why he had survived. That afternoon, a young man named Isaiah approached him after the service. He looked barely 20. Hoodie over his head, eyes guarded. That message, Isaiah said. That was me. That is me. Marcus looked at him, heart already breaking open. I'm glad you came. Isaiah fumbled with his words. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. My mom kicked me out. I've been couch surfing. I almost didn't come today. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. You came. That's all that matters. We've got a room for you and a family. Isaiah broke down, crying. That night Marcus sat on the steps of the restoration house with Isaiah beside him, a plate of leftover food in his lap. You see that bench over there? Marcus said, pointing toward the sidewalk. Isaiah nodded. That's where my story turned around. You don't have to wait for a miracle. You're already in one. Isaiah looked at him, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think God really sees me? Marcus smiled. I know he does. And now, I see you too. Inside, Erica was setting out extra linens. Tyrese was prepping a new intake form. Dre was making late-night tea for a few of the residents. And in the distance, lights from the city flickered like quiet promises. Marcus closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. A new soul had come home. And grace was still sitting on every bench. The days following Marcus's sermon brought a wave of unexpected responses. Emails flooded in from people across the country. Some from pastors asking Marcus to speak at their churches. Others from men and women who had never stepped inside a sanctuary but had watched the live stream from shelters, prison cells, rehab centers. They wrote things like, I didn't think God still used people like us, and you helped me believe again. Marcus read every message, not because he wanted praise, but because he remembered what it felt like to wonder if anyone even cared you were still alive. He began to answer them slowly, personally, with the same kind of care Steven had once shown him. A few sentences, sometimes a full letter, sometimes just, I see you. You matter. Keep going. Erica watched him from across their shared home office, amazed by his heart. One evening she set her laptop aside, walked over, and gently closed his journal. You need rest too, she said softly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, smiling. I know it's just hard. These voices, They sound like mine used to. She pulled him to his feet. Then let's make sure you don't lose yours again. They took the weekend and drove out to the coast. Quiet mornings, long walks, sunrises with no schedule. Marcus stood with his feet in the surf one morning, watching the waves roll in endlessly. "How does the ocean keep coming?" he asked aloud. Erica came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Same way Grace does. It doesn't stop. It just waits for us to step into it." Back home, the restoration house expanded again. This time, they didn't add a building. They added a garden. A donated plot of land next to the original house became the Grace Garden, a space where residents could grow vegetables, flowers, and herbs. But more than that, it became a metaphor. Marcus insisted the garden be cultivated by hand, no machines, so the residents could feel the soil, feel the process, experience something living grow under their care. "Recovery is just like this," he told the men. "You plant something, you water it, and then you wait. You don't rush the sun, you just stay faithful." They planted tomatoes, kale, lavender, rosemary, even strawberries, despite warnings that they were tricky to grow. Tyrese laughed, holding a packet of seeds. "Strawberries? You going soft on us, Marcus?" "Nah," Marcus said. "I just think we all deserve something sweet." In time, the garden bloomed. It became a place of peace. Men would sit between rows in the evening and talk about their days. Some meditated, some prayed, some just weeded in silence, letting the work quiet their restless thoughts. One afternoon, Marcus walked out and found Isaiah sitting on the edge of a raised bed, sketching in a worn notebook. "You draw?" Marcus asked. Isaiah shrugged. "Used to, before everything." Marcus sat beside him. "You still do. Don't downplay it. What's in that notebook matters." Isaiah smiled slightly, then turned the page to show Marcus a sketch of the bench where Marcus had been found. Under it, Isaiah had written, in careful block letters, "Every miracle needs a place to begin." Marcus's throat tightened. He put an arm around Isaiah's shoulder. "You're gonna change lives with that gift." Isaiah looked at him. "Like you?" "No," Marcus said gently. "In your own way. And that's even better." News of the Grace Garden began to spread. Just like everything else Marcus touched. Local news did a feature. Donations increased. Other recovery centers called, asking how to start something similar. But Marcus stayed grounded. Every week he still sat at the bench. Every week he walked the halls of the house. Every week he answered letters from people no one else saw. One afternoon he got a visit he hadn't expected. It was Marcus's high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Ellis. Now retired, hair grayer but eyes still kind. "I saw your name on the news," she said, smiling. "Had to see it with my own eyes." Marcus hugged her tightly. "You were the first person who ever believed in me." She wiped a tear. "And I never stopped." They walked through the garden together. She met Isaiah, Dre, Tyrese, Erica. She sat at the dinner table with them that night, listening to their stories with awe. As she left, she took Marcus's hands in hers. "I want you to know," she said, "that what you're doing now, it's what teachers and counselors and pastors dream of. You're not just saving lives, you're redeeming futures." Marcus didn't speak. He just held her hands, nodded slowly, and let the tears fall freely. That night, he wrote again in his journal, "Some things take years to bloom, but when they do, it's worth every cold night, every unanswered prayer, every moment you thought you were alone, because you weren't. Not really. You were just waiting for the season to change." And outside, in the moonlit garden, the strawberries were just starting to ripen. Summer returned like an old friend, warm and vibrant, breathing new energy into the streets of Charlotte. Grace Walk hosted its largest outreach yet, what they called the Love Without Walls campaign. Volunteers handed out hygiene kits, hot meals, clean clothes, and offered mobile showers and prayer tents all over the city. Marcus stood at the heart of it, clipboard in hand, hugging people as they arrived, remembering names most had forgotten about themselves. But behind the scenes, he was preparing for something even bigger. Marcus had been invited to speak at a national leadership conference in Atlanta. one attended by pastors, CEOs, nonprofit directors, and community organizers from across the country. It was the first time he'd be standing on a national stage without Steven beside him. He was honored and terrified. He shared this with Erica one night as they sat on their back porch, cicadas humming in the trees. "I feel like I don't belong up there," he said, staring out at the dark. She reached for his hand. "Why? Because you didn't go to seminary? Because you don't wear a suit? Because I still feel like that guy under the blanket on a bench." She turned to him. "That guy is why you belong there. You've walked through fire, Marcus. And you didn't just survive. You came out carrying buckets of water for others." He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. A week later, Marcus stood backstage in Atlanta, mic clipped to his collar, waiting for the introduction to finish. The crowd was massive. Thousands of people, leaders, thinkers, influencers, all waiting to hear from him. When his name was called, he stepped out into the lights. He began the same way he always did. "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to tell you the truth." He told them about the bench, about the rain, about the hunger, about Steven, about the day someone chose not to walk by. He told them about Grace Walk, about the restoration houses, about Tyrese and Jalen and Isaiah and the strawberries. And then he said something that stopped the entire room. "You don't need more credentials to love people. You need more compassion. Credentials don't sit with you in the dark. Compassion does." A hush fell over the room. He continued, "Stop waiting until you feel qualified to show up for someone. You don't need to be a hero. You just need to be human." At the end of the talk, the room stood in a long, thunderous ovation. But Marcus didn't stand there soaking it in. He stepped back, bowed his head, and whispered a prayer. "Let this never be about me." After the talk, dozens of leaders waited to meet him. Some asked about replicating the restoration model. Others just wanted to say thank you. One woman, a pastor from Philadelphia, handed him a folded note and said, "Read this later. It's not for today." Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus opened it. "I was raped when I was 16. I spent the next 10 years punishing myself, believing I was ruined. I watched your talk, and for the first time I didn't feel broken. I felt brave. Thank you for helping me believe I'm more than my pain." Marcus sat on the bed, the letter trembling in his hands. He wept quietly, not out of sadness, but out of reverence for what Grace could do. When he returned to Charlotte, there was a different kind of energy in him. Not pride, not exhaustion, just clarity. He called a meeting with the Grace Walk leadership team and announced his next vision. "I want to launch a mentorship initiative," he said. "One-on-one partnerships between people in recovery and people who've walked through it. We're calling it Bench Partners, because the best change I ever experienced came when someone just sat with me." The room lit up. Each person will have a partner, someone who's not trying to fix them, just someone who refuses to leave. It won't be about preaching, it'll be about presence. Within a month, Bench Partners was born. The idea was simple but revolutionary. No hierarchy, no titles, just matched souls who met once a week, face-to-face or on video call, to talk, walk, pray, or sit in silence if needed. Tyrese took on the role of lead coordinator. Isaiah began designing the visual branding, shirts, journals, stickers, all printed with a single phrase: "Sit, stay, see." The program exploded. People from all over the country signed up to be partners. Some were former addicts. Some were retired teachers. Some were single moms. All of them knew what it meant to hurt. All of them wanted to help. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the garden, Marcus stood quietly watching Isaiah help a new resident plant a row of mint. Steven walked up beside him. "You always did like planting seeds," Steven said. Marcus smiled. "You taught me how to water them." They stood there in silence for a moment before Marcus spoke again. "You think we'll ever know how far this goes? The impact, I mean." Steven looked out at the rows of growing things, at the men and women now walking in peace, at the old bench just visible in the distance. "We don't have to," he said. "We just have to keep showing up." Marcus nodded, and as the stars began to blink into the sky above Charlotte, He whispered once more the same words that had carried him from that first night on the street to this moment of legacy. "I see you. You matter. Keep going." The heat of summer slowly began to fade, and with the first signs of autumn came the anniversary of a moment that had changed everything. The day Marcus sat on that bench and Steven chose not to walk past. It had been exactly 3 years since that rain-soaked afternoon when Grace stepped in, disguised as an old friend. To honor the day, the Grace Walk team organized something simple, exactly the way Marcus wanted it. No banners, no cameras, no stage. Just a gathering at the park where it all began. They called it Bench Day. People came, residents, volunteers, neighbors, strangers who had only read about Marcus online. Some brought flowers, others brought handwritten notes. One woman brought a tiny wooden sculpture of a bench she had carved herself. Marcus arrived quietly, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie, no fanfare. Tyrese opened the evening with a few words. "This bench," he said, "ain't just metal and wood. It's where someone said, 'I see you.' It's where hope sat down and refused to leave." Then, one by one, others shared stories. A man who'd been sober for 6 months said he passed by this bench every morning and whispered a prayer because it reminded him that someone like Marcus had made it. A teenage girl from a local high school said the bench gave her courage to speak up about being bullied. Even Curtis, the Vietnam vet from Nashville, had sent a letter that someone read aloud. In it, he wrote, "I used to sit in the dark wondering if anyone remembered me. Then Marcus sat down beside me and proved that God hadn't forgotten. Now I sit with others. That's my calling now." As dusk settled over the park, Marcus finally stepped forward. He sat on the bench, elbows on his knees, and looked out at the people gathered. "I used to think this bench was where I lost everything," he began, "but now I know. It's where I found something better than what I was chasing. I found mercy. I found friendship. I found a reason to believe again." He looked up, his eyes soft. "And if God can do that for me, He can do it for anyone." He paused, then smiled. "Happy Bench Day." The crowd laughed gently, some through tears. A few clapped, but mostly people just stood in quiet reverence. Later that evening, Marcus walked the park with Steven. They said little, just took in the trees, the cool air, the sound of healing that had no words. At one point, Marcus stopped, took a deep breath, and said, "I'm thinking about writing the full story down." Steven nodded. "It's time. I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about them, the people who never gave up, even when the world did." "Then that's what it will be." In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to write. Not just the headlines or the highlights, but the raw truth. The night terrors, the relapses, the guilt. The quiet voice that once told him he'd die alone. And the louder voice that came later, the one that told him to get up anyway. Erica helped organize the chapters. Tyrese shared his story too. Dre wrote the foreword. Isaiah designed the cover. A simple image of a bench under a street lamp and the title, "Still Here." The book was released the following spring and became an unexpected bestseller. But Marcus didn't go on a traditional book tour. Instead, he and Erica packed a van with copies, drove city to city, and gave them away for free at shelters, recovery centers, high schools, libraries, bus stops. Sometimes they stayed and talked. Sometimes they just sat quietly with whoever needed company. Everywhere they went, the story resonated. Not because it was polished, but because it was honest. One night, after giving a talk at a women's shelter in Ohio, Marcus sat outside with a young mother named Nina. She had escaped an abusive relationship and was living with her toddler in a temporary dorm room. "I read your book," she said softly, "and it made me feel less dirty." Marcus looked at her, deeply moved. "You're not dirty. You're strong. You're sacred. You're more than the worst thing that happened to you." She began to cry, not loudly, just tears that had been waiting too long to fall. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" "No," Marcus said gently. "But you'll feel something better than normal. You'll feel whole." Before they left, Nina handed him a drawing her daughter had made, a stick figure sitting on a bench with a heart in the sky above it. She said, That's where people get better. Marcus framed it and hung it in his office when they returned to Charlotte. By then, the third restoration house had opened its doors. Grace Garden had expanded into a second plot across the street. Bench partners had reached 10 countries. And the Scene Project had sparked partnerships with over 200 local ministries around the world. But Marcus never stopped walking the halls, never stopped sitting with the newest resident, never stopped visiting the bench. He said once in an interview, "You can build 100 houses and still lose your way if you forget the bench." He hadn't, and neither had the people who followed him. On the second bench day, a boy from Philadelphia flew in with his mother just to see Marcus. The boy had been contemplating suicide the year before, but read Still Here in a juvenile detention center and found the courage to ask for help. Now he was 14 months clean and studying to be a counselor. When Marcus hugged him, he whispered the same thing Steven once whispered to him, "You're not a mistake, you're a miracle." Winter arrived quietly that year, like a soft blanket settling over the city. For the first time since its founding, all 3 restoration houses celebrated the holidays under one roof. They rented a large community hall downtown. Long tables, strings of warm white lights, homemade decorations crafted by the residents. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of life. Marcus stood in the back of the room, watching it all unfold. The men in jackets and ties, women in dresses, children with paper crowns and faces sticky from pie. There were smiles where there had once been despair, laughter where there had once been silence, and in the center of it all stood Erica, holding a plate of cookies, laughing as she helped an elderly resident hang mistletoe. Steven walked up behind Marcus and leaned in. "You did good," he said. Marcus shook his head. "We did good." Steven smiled. "How's the book tour?" Marcus shrugged. "Exhausting, but beautiful. I never thought people would line up to talk about a bench." Steven chuckled. It was never about the bench. It was about the one who didn't stay on it. The night continued with testimonies, music, and a shared meal that stretched late into the evening. When it was time for Marcus to speak, he didn't take the mic. Instead, he climbed onto one of the tables, playfully, and raised his hands for attention. "I could say a lot tonight," he began, voice echoing gently through the room. "I could talk about where we came from. I could talk about how we got here. But the truth is, none of this is about the past. It's about what we do next." He looked across the room at faces shining with hope. "You are not statistics. You are not your records. You are not what they called you in the courtroom, or what you called yourself at your lowest. You are sons and daughters. You are builders. You are healers. And the world needs what you have." He paused, then finished. "Don't waste your redemption. Live it." They stood. They clapped. Some wept. Others just bowed their heads in reverence. And as the night wore down, Marcus found himself back on the front steps of the hall, sipping coffee as snow began to fall. Erica joined him, wrapping a scarf tighter around her neck. "You looked pretty confident up on that table," she teased. He laughed. "I still feel like the guy cleaning toilets most days. That's why people follow you." He looked over at her, quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "About marriage." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but her expression stayed warm. "Oh, really?" "Yeah. I don't want to rush, I know what we have, and I know what we've built, and I want to build more. With you." She stepped closer. "I want that too." He smiled. "Well, good. Because I already asked Steven for advice." She laughed. "Oh no. What did he say?" "Something about making sure I don't propose on a bench because it's too obvious." They laughed together under the falling snow, their breath warm in the cold air. And in that moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't truly felt in all his years of recovery. Peace. Not just gratitude, not just survival, but deep-rooted peace. The kind that said, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." In the following weeks, Marcus continued to write. Not for a publisher, not for another book, but for the future. He started a legacy project, a curriculum for churches and nonprofits to learn how to walk with the wounded, as he called it. No theology degrees required, just compassion, training, and willingness to listen. He titled it, "The Ministry of Presence." The first line of the guide read, "Before you speak, sit. Before you advise, listen. Before you fix, feel, and never forget." Most people don't need a sermon, they need a friend. It was distributed freely, downloaded in over 30 countries in the first 2 months. But Marcus didn't chase numbers. He chased names. He still walked into every restoration house each week. He still knelt beside new residents on intake day. He still cleaned up after dinner when no one was looking, because that's how he had started, and that's how he intended to finish. One Sunday afternoon, he and Steven visited the bench again, now preserved with weather-resistant materials, polished plaque, and flower beds maintained by Grace Walk volunteers. They sat together, no cameras, no ceremony, just old friends. Steven looked over at Marcus. "You ever think about how different your life would be if you hadn't looked up that day?" "All the time." "And if I hadn't stopped?" Marcus turned to him. "Then maybe I wouldn't have lived to become the man who stops for others." Steven nodded. "One moment, one decision, and the ripple just keeps going." Marcus looked out over the street. "And we haven't even seen the last ripple yet." They sat in silence, the hum of the city around them, and then Steven stood to leave. Marcus stayed. He placed one hand on the cold metal of the bench and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the bench, but to the God who had waited for him there. The following spring marked a turning point not only in Marcus's life, but in the very movement he had helped create. The Restoration Network, formerly just 3 homes and a garden, had now expanded into 7 active recovery homes across 5 cities. Grace Walk had merged with several like-minded ministries, forming a national coalition for faith-based outreach to the homeless and addicted. The Scene Project had opened its first creative arts center for youth in crisis. And yet, for Marcus, nothing felt bigger than what was happening in his personal life. On a warm April morning under the shade of an old oak tree in a simple backyard garden surrounded by family, residents, volunteers, and lifelong friends, Marcus and Erica got married. It was not a wedding filled with luxury or spectacle. It was filled with stories. Before the vows, Tyrese stood and read a poem he had written. Isaiah presented them with a charcoal drawing of the bench with 2 figures sitting side by side, one reaching out, the other just beginning to lift his head. Dre officiated the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion as he said, "There are many ways to say I love you, but Marcus, you've spent your life showing us all what it looks like." When it was time for Marcus to speak his vows, he turned to Erica and took a deep breath. "I thought redemption would come to me in a moment," he said, eyes locked on hers. "But it came slowly, through a bench, through a friend, through a journey I never saw coming. But the most beautiful part of that journey is you. You didn't come to rescue me. You came to walk with me, and for the rest of my days, I promise to walk with you." They kissed under the canopy of spring leaves, and the crowd cheered with all the joy of a people who knew what it meant to see the impossible come to life. Later that night, Steven pulled Marcus aside and handed him a small gift box. Inside was a miniature silver bench, engraved at the bottom, "For the day you chose to stand up." Marcus looked at him, tears rising. "You started all this, Steven." Steven smiled. "No, I just sat down. You're the one who got back up." Over the following months, Marcus began working on a long-term vision, a permanent retreat center, a space for people in transition to come away for a time, rest, heal, and discover their identity before stepping back into the world. He found a quiet property just outside the city, full of trees, a lake, and room for cabins and trails. They named it the Still Place. The idea was simple: not therapy, not treatment, just stillness, a sacred pause, where no one was pressured to be better, where people could just be. Construction took months, but volunteers came by the dozens. Former residents helped lay floors and build fire pits. Local artists painted murals in the chapel space. Farmers donated trees for planting. And in the center of the retreat grounds, right by the lake, Marcus had something built. A bench, identical in design to the original one from the city. When it was finished, he and Erica walked out together and sat there for a long time. "This is where they'll come," Marcus said softly, "when they feel like there's nothing left, when they need quiet more than noise." Erica nodded. "This is where healing will begin. In the first year alone, The still place hosted over 300 guests. Trauma survivors, caregivers, first responders, veterans, former inmates, young leaders on the edge of burnout. Each left with something they couldn't explain but knew they had needed: peace. Marcus didn't run the retreats. He just showed up once in a while, walked the trails, listened, and always sat on the bench. One afternoon, he sat beside a middle-aged woman who had lost both her sons to overdose within 2 years. She said almost nothing, just cried. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "Why didn't I see it coming?" Marcus reached over and gently took her hand. "Because love sometimes blinds us to the storm. That's not your failure. That's your heart." She wept harder. Marcus stayed. He didn't try to fix it, he just stayed. Later, she would write to him, "You saved me that day," without saying a word. Years passed. The ministry kept growing. New leaders rose. Tyrese started his own program in Philadelphia. Jalen opened a youth mentorship center. Isaiah had his first art show in New York. Marcus never stopped showing up. He never stopped sitting down. He never stopped remembering the man he once was, because that memory kept him soft, humble, willing to sit in the pain of others. But now, it wasn't pain that defined him. It was presence, and through that presence, thousands of lives had been touched. On the 10th anniversary of Bench Day, Marcus sat quietly alone at the original bench in Charlotte. A soft breeze stirred the trees overhead. The city hummed around him, unchanged in many ways, but utterly transformed in others. He ran his hand over the familiar plaque, still polished by faithful volunteers. Here sat a man the world forgot, and a friend who refused to. Grace found them both. Behind him, a group of kids played tag. A woman walked by with a stroller. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Marcus closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." And Grace, as always, was too. Years later, long after the original bench had become a quiet landmark in Charlotte, and long after the Restoration Network had grown into a national web of healing spaces, Marcus found himself returning to a more personal rhythm. He no longer led every meeting. He no longer appeared at every event. Instead, he focused on mentoring a small group of young leaders, people who reminded him of the man he once was, full of questions, full of fire, full of fear. He spent more time at the still place now, walking the trails in the early morning mist, sitting by the lake with his journal, and meeting quietly with visitors who carried their burdens like silent anchors. His health had changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing life-threatening, just the weight of years spent pouring out. His doctor told him to slow down. He laughed and said, "I've been slowing down since I got off that bench." Erica stayed by his side, still his strongest ally, still his home. They had built a life rooted in service, but rich in love. Their evenings were simple: books, music, tea, laughter, sometimes silence, the kind that feels like a gift when shared with someone who understands your soul. One evening, as they sat watching the sun dip below the lake, Erica turned to him and asked, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Steven hadn't stopped?" Marcus looked out across the still waters, thoughtful. "All the time," he said, "but not with fear anymore, with awe." He paused, then continued, "I think about how one moment changed not just my life, but hundreds, maybe thousands. One person choosing presence over convenience." Erica smiled. "And you did the same for others." "I tried." "You did more than try, Marcus. You gave people a future." A few weeks later, Marcus received an invitation from a college in Chicago. They were hosting a global summit on community restoration and wanted to honor him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. The email listed his many accolades: best-selling author, founder of 7 recovery centers, leader of Bench Partners, creator of The Still Place. But none of those titles mattered much to him. He replied simply, "I'm honored, but only if I can bring the team with me." He flew to Chicago with Tyrese, Isaiah, Dre, and Jalen, all of whom were now leading their own organizations and initiatives. They took the stage together, a living testimony of what happens when you don't give up on people. When Marcus spoke, he began with the same words he always had: "I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to tell you the truth." He looked out at the packed auditorium and continued, I was once a man no one would have invited to something like this. I had nothing. I was nothing in my own eyes. But someone saw past that, and that seeing saved me. He turned to his team. These men beside me aren't just my legacy. They're the proof that grace keeps working long after the moment passes. He closed with a quiet, powerful line. Never underestimate the power of staying. The crowd gave him a standing ovation, but he simply stepped back, bowed his head, and let the moment pass without fanfare. Later, back in his hotel room, Marcus sat on the bed, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. Erica called. "How was it?" she asked. "Beautiful," he replied. "You okay?" "Yeah, just remembering." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come home soon." "I will." Before he went to bed, he pulled out his old, nearly worn-through journal. On the last blank page he wrote, "From the bench to the blessing, from the gutter to the garden, from forgotten to found, and still, I'm just a man who refused to walk by." The following year, Marcus officially stepped back from leadership. He didn't announce a retirement. He didn't post about it. He simply passed the torch, one hand at a time, one life at a time. He and Erica spent their time mentoring, traveling to quiet places, returning often to the bench, to the house, to the garden. Wherever people gathered to remember grace, Marcus showed up, not to lead, but to sit. One cool autumn afternoon, he returned to the original bench alone. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to fall. He sat down slowly, hands folded, eyes distant. A young man walked by, hood up, head low, shoulders tense. Marcus recognized that posture. He'd worn it for years. "Hey," Marcus called softly. The young man stopped. "You okay?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." Marcus motioned to the bench. "Sit a minute." The boy sat cautiously. They didn't talk at first. They just sat, like Marcus and Steven had done all those years ago. After a while, the boy said, "I don't know where to go anymore." Marcus nodded. "I didn't either, but someone sat with me anyway, and that changed everything." The boy looked at him. "You really think people like me can change?" Marcus smiled. "I don't just think it, I've lived it." They sat until the sun dipped low behind the buildings. And then, as the boy stood to leave, Marcus said one last thing. "You're not invisible. I see you." The boy nodded slowly. "Thank you." When he walked away, Marcus closed his eyes. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know his story. But he knew that one moment of presence could write the first line of a brand new chapter. And that was enough. He stood slowly, turned toward the street, and whispered with a smile, "Still here." And grace, eternal and unshakable, walked with him, always. If you made it to the end of this story, then maybe something inside you is waking up. Maybe you've been that person on the bench, tired, forgotten, wondering if anyone sees you. Or maybe you've walked past someone like Marcus and didn't stop because you didn't know what to say or what to do. But now you know. You don't need the perfect words. You just need to show up. This story isn't just about Marcus. It's about all of us. About second chances. About brokenness turning into beauty. About the quiet power of presence. One friend, one moment, one "I see you" can change someone's entire life. So I want to ask you something from the heart. Who is waiting on your bench right now? Who needs you to stop, to sit, to stay? You don't need to be a pastor. You don't need to be famous. You just need to care. Because grace isn't about platforms or pulpits. It's about people. And it's about never forgetting that sometimes the most powerful sermon is simply staying. If this story touched you, please, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Send it to someone who needs hope. Post it. Talk about it. Be the person who carries light into someone's dark place. And finally, if you're still watching right now, that's not by accident. God is trying to reach your heart. He sees you. He hasn't given up on you. So don't give up on yourself. You're not broken beyond repair. You're not too far gone. You're still here. And that means your story isn't over. If this message resonated with you, leave a comment below. Let us know what part spoke to your soul. Subscribe for more real stories like this, stories that heal, stories that matter. And remember this: the bench is always waiting, and grace always finds a way. God bless you. You are seen, you are loved. Keep going.